These are the lecture notes for Chapter 23 for the part that we did not cover in class. I'm going to start out by reviewing what we did cover in class. Here we go. This is slide number 4, and it's the table 23.1, and it just goes over the characteristics that all plants share, and then it goes over the groups of plants, how we divided the plants into various groups based on vascular tissue or whether or not they produce seeds or spores. So we start off by saying that the domain of plants is the eukarya. Plants are in the supergroup Archaeoplastida, along with the red and green algae. The kingdom within the domain eukarya is the plantae, or the plant kingdom. And plants are multicellular. They undergo an alternation of generations life cycle. They alternate between the haploid and diploid form. Plants all protect the embryo either with a spore or seed, and many plants have a waxy cuticle which prevents water loss. Now, moving on to the groups, the non-vascular plants, which are of course seedless, the non-vascular plants altogether are called the bryophytes. There are 3 members of the bryophytes: liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. And then we move on to the vascular plants that are seedless. So these 2 groups still produce spores. The lycophytes, which are often called the club mosses, even though they are vascular, so they're not a true moss. The lycophytes, or club mosses, have vascular tissue, but they produce spores. And the pteridophytes include the ferns and the horsetails and the whisk ferns. So the lycophytes and the pteridophytes are the 2 seedless vascular plants. Now we're going to move on to the vascular plants that do produce seeds. That's the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. And basically, gymnosperms are cone-bearing. They produce seed cones. And the seeds are inside the cones, and then they produce pollen on the male cones. In the angiosperm, the angiosperms bear flowers and many times a fruit that surrounds the seed. So let's move to the section on gymnosperms. Okay, this is a good section here. So this section just explains the evolution of seed plants, maybe what the benefit of having a seed would be. So the seed contains a sporophyte embryo, so a diploid embryo. In this way, it's kind of like an egg, like a chicken egg. It's got the embryo, and it's also got stored food within a protective seed coat, because seeds can go for long periods of dormancy, and then if you fertilize them and add water, they'll start to germinate. So we know this because of cooking things like dried beans and peas, So anyway, the seed contains both the embryo and the stored food within the seed. Seed plants are heterosporous, and that means they have microspores and megaspores. The microspores, remember, formed into, formed into the gametophyte that is male, and then the megaspores would form into the gametophyte, which is female. So microspore, which it says right down here, microspores became male gametophytes, or in other words, aka pollen grains, and the megaspores became female gametophytes. So pollination is when either the wind or an animal insect pollinator carries the pollen from the male part of the flower to the female gametophyte, or from the male part, in the case of gymnosperms, from the male cone to the female cone. So the sperm moved toward the female gametophyte through a pollen tube, and the megaspore develops into a female gametophyte within an ovule. And then whenever the ovule is fertilized, that becomes a seed. Gymnosperms are mostly cone-bearing seed plants. Angiosperms are flowering plants that also produce a fruit. Gymnosperm literally means naked seed. It means a seed that is not enclosed by a fruit. The 4 gymnosperm groups are the conifers, the cycads, the ginkgos, and the netophytes. And the conifers are the most plentiful. Conifers, like the beginning part of that word sounds like, these are plants that produce, or trees that produce cones. They have tough, think of a pine tree, or a loblolly pine, which is the North Carolina state tree. They have tough needle-like leaves of pine trees that conserve water. The cuticle is very thick and the stomata are recessed. That means they're kind of back a little bit in the tissues so that it minimizes water loss. Okay, the dominant generation is the sporophyte, of course, because the only plant we've learned where the dominant generation is the gametophyte is the bryophytes, the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. All other plants, sporophyte is dominant. Pollen grains in conifers are windblown rather than, being carried by insect pollinators, that kind of thing. The seed of the conifer tree is the dispersal stage, and that is also true in angiosperms. And conifers are monoecious, and that means a single plant produces both the male reproductive and the female reproductive structure. So it produces cones that bear pollen and cones that have seeds inside. That would be monoecious. And here you can see a picture. If you didn't know what I know you've seen these before in pine trees, but what the male cones look like, the pollen cones, this is what they look like. And then the female cones are the ones that we typically call pine cones. And those are where the seed is located, where the ovules are located. And when they get fertilized, they become the seeds. And these are different examples of conifers here. We've got the pine tree on the left, the spruce pine tree, and then the juniper. These are all conifers. And we're going to look at the life cycle of a pine tree, although I will only ask you on your next exam about the moss and the angiosperm life cycle, but it's interesting to look at it. So if you start with the pine tree itself, this is when I look outside and I see a pine tree growing in the ground, that is what I see is the sporophyte structure. It is the sporophyte organism. So starting there, within that sporophyte, within that pine tree, there are pollen cones that produce pollen and seed cones that produce ovules. So by the wind, the pollen is going to land on the seed cones. Okay, so it says a pollen cone has 2 pollen sacs that lie on the underside of each scale. Shows you. Kind of shows you that right here. And then it says the seed cones have 2 ovules that lie on the upper surface of each scale. So here's where this is what the ovules kind of look like, and this is what the pollen sacs look like. It says within the pollen sacs, meiosis produces 4 microspores, And within an ovule, meiosis produces 4 megaspores, but only one survives. This is very similar to what happens in animals as well. And each pollen grain has 2 wings, and it is carried by the wind to the seed cone during pollination. And then it says only one of the megaspores undergoes mitosis and develops into a mature female gametophyte having 2 to 6 archegonia. Each archegonium contains a single egg. Once a pollen grain reaches a seed cone, it becomes a mature male gametophyte. So the pollen grain is the male gametophyte. A pollen tube digests its way slowly toward a female gametophyte and discharges 2 non-flagellated sperm. One of these fertilizes an egg, and a zygote results. Okay, and anyway, you can read the rest of this, but basically the gametophyte structures are very reduced in comparison to how they were in the moss and the fern. They're very reduced structures. Okay. Uses of conifers. Pines are known for their beauty and pleasant smell. Their needles and bark are rich in the vitamins A and C. They can be used to create teas, teas that you drink. That we have a teas test in Allied Health, and so I was looking at that funny. But anyway, create teas, beverages that ease symptoms of a cold or cough. We cook pine nuts, and pine oil is used to clean floors and household appliances and things like that. So that was the conifers. Now we have 3 more groups within the gymnosperms. The cycads can have huge cones. Their cones can actually be more than 1 meter long. They have pollen and seed cones on separate plants, so we would call that dioecious instead of monoecious. They are pollinated by insects rather than the wind, and the sperm do have to swim to reach an egg. So they have to have a source of water. And this is a picture of a cycad, an African cycad, and you can see how big the cone is. Okay, then we have ginkgos, which there's only one surviving species on the earth today called the ginkgo biloba. It is dioecious. Some trees produce seeds and other trees produce pollen. So that would be the same as the cycads. This is a picture of ginkgo biloba. You can see the leaves and you can see the seeds. Gnetophytes would be the last group of the gymnosperms. They have similarly structured xylem. None of these organisms have archegonia. The strobili have a similar construction. And what they're known for is producing chemicals like ephedrine, and the plant Welwitschia is found in southwestern Africa. It has only 2 enormous strap-like leaves. But it can live for like 1,000 years. It doesn't have that information on this slide, so you would have to Google it. But Welwitschia has a very, very long lifespan, longer than humans for sure. And this is a picture of ephedra, which produces ephedrine. And this is the Welwitschia. Like I say, I know it can live hundreds, if not 1,000 years. And then we have the section on angiosperms. Let me look at our time.